At the age of 71, the Renal Association is drawing to a close and moving forward in a new era as part of the UK Kidney Association. Founded in 1950, the Renal Association, I hope you know, is the oldest continuously active nephrology society in the world. The International Society of Nephrology was only founded in 1960, EDTA-ERA in 1964, the ASN in 1966. They're all mere striplings. I've been a Renal Association member for 41 years. Not bad, although there are many still alive with 50 years or more of membership. And in the 71 years, there have been 24 Renal Association presidents, and I've been fortunate enough to work closely with 12 of them, including 2 who trained me, 1 who examined my DM thesis, and 1 who was my main hero as a young doctor desperate to become a nephrologist. The Renal Association president has asked me, as RA archivist, to reminisce about those 71 years, both before and since I became a member. I'm going to give you a personal view of some of the most important things we should never forget about the RA as it moves into its new chapter in the UK Kidney Association. Many have done much for the association. I cannot mention everyone, so I've decided I will not name anyone, because the association is bigger than any individuals, whether the presidents or the many other leaders and members who've done so much and expected no glory in return. The Renal Association is, of course, unrecognizable from its early days. When it was founded in 1950, there was no nephrology, no diuretics. The only blood pressure tablets were intolerable because of postural hypotension, no renal biopsy. Acute peritoneal dialysis was happening on a war footing in MASH units in Korea, but there was no other dialysis or transplantation. And the RA started as just a small scientific meeting of people intellectually interested in the kidney. A few physicians, physiologists, urologists, obstetricians, 27 people at the first meeting. And the transformation to the RA we know today is a result of relentless development, of which all of you who are members and leaders of the association should be proud. Because along the way, there have been many potential pitfalls, nearly all of which have been avoided, and many opportunities, nearly all of which have been taken. That change was quite slow to start with. When I became a member in 1980, clinical nephrology had been established for 15 years or so in the UK, but there were only about 50 consultant nephrologists in the UK and barely 250 RA members. And in 1980, there were 2 one-day meetings a year, always in London, typically with fewer than 100 at a meeting. And when it was decided from the mid-1980s that 1 meeting each year would actually be held outside London, there was a frisson of controversy. The meetings were always at the Institute of Child Health behind Great Ormond Street Hospital. The scientific atmosphere was rigorous, the questioning could be intimidating, but afterwards we all went round the corner to the nearest pub, the Lamb in Conduit Street, and the meeting continued, filling the bar and spilling onto the pavement. Everyone knew everyone. For a young nephrologist, your heroes were approachable over a beer in the Lamb. There was chatter and gossip and exchange and encouragement. Collaborations were being established with project plans being scribbled on beer mats. It was great to be part of it. And the RA still saw its role then as rather simple, providing in its meetings a scientific forum and supporting research. Without the RA, remember, there would not have been Kidney Research UK. It was launched by the RA as a National Kidney Research Fund in the late 1960s, gradually gaining its autonomy. And the RA has quite rightly remained an active promoter and facilitator of research, even though the era when it was de rigueur to do some full-time research and get a higher degree if you would have any chance of becoming a consultant nephrologist may have gone. Supporting research now for the RA has meant making the right response to complex national R&D agendas from the mid-90s onwards, leading the way in the UK Kidney Research Consortium and in clinical specialty groups. And the RA always also saw itself as educating, at first through its regular meetings, and this of course continues, but soon also through its very successful advanced nephrology course, And don't forget the crucial role the RA played with other specialist societies working with the college to ensure the emergence of a sensible and well-run specialty certificate examination, now the European Specialty Exam. But as the RA worked out how it might grow beyond those two basics of education and research support, there were risks to face and avoid. The first risk was that the Renal Association might split. Dialysis was coming to dominate much of our clinical life from the 1960s onwards. But in a response to a proposal in the early days for a symposium on dialysis at one of the RA meetings, the executive committee declared that dialysis was not deemed a topic worthy of scientific study. Now, we wince with embarrassment, but actually at that time, both sides had a point. Dialysis was already the core of our clinical work and therefore, of course, should be studied. And it made no sense to have RA meetings which seemed to be dominated almost exclusively by nephritis and the brown Norway rat and distal tubular potassium fluxes. But in their defense, the skeptics would point to the uncomfortably heavy influence at that time of business and corporate money on dialysis development and on the nephrology world. This was the time when the European Dialysis and Transplant Association, the EDTA, was mockingly known by its critics as the European Dining and Travel Association. Now, several countries failed to hold that tension, and two or more separate nephrology societies emerged, one interested in dialysis, one in renal science, to the detriment of nephrology as a whole. France, Germany, the USA, for example. And an informal dialysis group did begin to coalesce in the UK in the 1970s, but sane voices prevailed here, and the RA did not split. We kept together clinicians, lab scientists, clinical researchers, academics. A second risk was that the Renal Association would remain purely a scientific organization and not become a clinical opinion leader or policy influencer. Before the late 1980s, Renal Association members had occasionally advised government, but only because they were asked as individuals. They did not represent the RA. For example, in the 1960s, when chronic dialysis began to take off, the Department of Health approved the plan proposed by its working party chaired by Hugh de Wardener, that it should be 20 dialysis units in the UK. And they began to be established, and they should have opened the door for continuing dialysis expansion. But the RA itself had played no direct role in that. And then came 1969, which I hope you all know was the annus horribilis for dialysis in the UK. There were major outbreaks of hepatitis B in several units, including Edinburgh, Manchester, Guy's. Patients died, staff died. Manchester Royal Infirmary, for example, there were only 6 chronic patients dialyzing in their newly established unit there. They all died. A young nephrologist in another unit, now a Renal Association past president, was severely ill with viral hepatitis and could hardly work for a year. Hepatitis B was a disaster which set back the growth of dialysis for the next 20 years or so. Now, RA members at an individual level were supporting and encouraging each other through these very difficult times, but the RA had no structures to have a voice or influence policy. When a strategy was needed about blood-borne virus infections in dialysis units, it was the Rosenheim Committee which investigated the hepatitis outbreak and made recommendations in 1972 for prevention. They were good, but it came from outside our community because the RA had no structures and no voice. And even by the 1980s, many still thought it should not have, that the Royal College of Physicians should do all that sort of thing, and the Renal Association should just do science. But gradually it became clear that the college had neither the energy, the resources, nor the specialist knowledge to be the influencer which we needed. And a pivotal moment came in 1987, when the Renal Association president and 2 past presidents got themselves into the office of the Secretary of State for Health. And they made the case and won it, that there must be sustainable expansion of dialysis services, that people were dying unnecessarily, and that for now a minimum take on of 40 per million per year should be policy. Of course, that figure seems ridiculously low now compared to the 120 per million which are being taken on in our units. But one reason that they won the argument that day was because they had data. Published peer-reviewed data from collaboration across several parts of the UK, showing in that era when many fewer older people were being dialysed, that 40 per million was a sound estimate, a good starting point. As they sat there, the Secretary of State wrote down the figure 40 per million, and it became departmental policy. And of course, once we had that starting point, there was no stopping the expansion of renal replacement therapy. Such success meant that the RA's internal discussion soon ended. The RA would continue to be a scientific association, but should, indeed must, also be a clinical opinion leader, a driver of policy, speaking for the kidney community. The RA took this on wholeheartedly and has never looked back. And it has generated the structures to ensure we could respond to events, meet crises, anticipate problems, and give a coherent voice. A third risk was that the Renal Association would fail to embrace and meet the needs of a widening nephrology community. Nephrology had started as a teaching hospital specialty. That's where renal units were sited. Most consultants were clinical academics. But by the early 2000s, there were 80 adult renal units, many away from teaching centres, and 13 paediatric units, and the RA already had 1,000 members. District General Hospital nephrologists had formed a group to support each other. Non-consultant career grades were playing a valued role in many units, and it was very important for their voice to be properly heard in the RA, and to make the RA relevant to all was an important challenge. And I think the RA has got steadily better at that. 2 presidents in the last 20 years have chosen systematically to visit all renal units to demonstrate practically that the RA is interested in its whole constituency, and I think this has very probably helped. The partnership between adult and paediatric nephrology has also needed some attention from time to time. There were tiffs. Paediatricians regarding large, busy adult units as uncaring environments to which they had to transfer the young adults they had nurtured. Adult units disappointed that they had to deal with immature young adults arriving from paediatrics and their demanding parents. And behind this was genuine anxiety about the transition of young adults and its risks. But rather than both whinging, the Renal Association and the British Association for Paediatric Nephrology got together to write a transition strategy which set the scene for UK improvements, long preceding, for example, any output from NICE. And there was also concern about the management of rare renal diseases in young people who are now for the first time surviving to need adult care. And that was one of the motivations for the RA and BAPN together to write a rare renal disease strategy. And it seems to me that from the trust those shared efforts have engendered has emerged the sensible relationship between the RA and the BAPN, which persists. And what about our trainees? One founder of the Senior Registrar Club in the late 1980s, now the SPR Club, was told by a senior colleague it was a bad mistake. The club would just be seen as a group of bolshy juniors whinging about the lack of consultant jobs. That, of course, was wrong advice. The SPR Club has flourished, and it's very important that the RA has now properly found ways of embracing it. But I think there has been one important error. Personally, I think that the British Renal Society need never have existed. In the 1990s, there were meetings between RA leaders on the one hand, and on the other hand, advocates of an organisation supporting the multidisciplinary team, which became the BRS. They had frank exchanges of views, as the saying goes, but failed to find common ground and went their separate ways. They could have done, and I think should have found common ground, but in my view were foiled sadly by the ego and unrestrained testosterone of a few key leading voices on both sides. Characteristics which have happily been lacking in the vast majority of RA leaders before or since, and happily lacking in those who've recently had the wisdom and diplomacy to bring us to this new integrated era of the UK Kidney Association. A fourth risk was that the Renal Association might not grasp the opportunity of the health informatics revolution. Every day we take for granted that IT systems are there and ready to assist us as we deliver care for people with kidney disease. But of course, this was not always so. For example, when I was a registrar, the way to get results after the transplant clinic was to phone the biochemistry lab and transcribe the results by hand into a paper flowchart in the patient's notes as the lab staff read them out. Now, the Renal Association cannot claim credit for inventing Proton and the other clinical information systems which renal units take for granted now. But the RA does take credit for driving and supporting the enthusiasms of those who saw that a UK renal registry was a real possibility with great potential benefits. Because we had Proton and other systems from which to extract data, we had the 40 per million paper and other examples proving that we could collaborate and share data. But remember that the RA took serious risks with the registry. At first, there was just a grant from a pilot project. It was by no means certain that a registry could be successful technically, would be sustainable, underwrote the burgeoning cost, and could have got into real financial difficulty. But now the RA has a UK renal registry of which to be proud. And we know about comparative unit performance and the opportunities now afforded by a comprehensive registry for epidemiological studies, for public health research, audit, quality improvement. And the RA has kept control and not let the registry slip into central government hands. The registry, of course, is not perfect. For example, you could argue it's taken longer than it might to develop the quality improvement role for which it is so ideally suited. The registry is not perfect, but it's very, very good. And talking of digital revolution, without the Renal Association, there would be no patient view. When Renal Patient View emerged in 2006, it came from an RA initiative to share ideas for digital development right across the kidney community. Patient View is unique and very successful, but it might well not have survived unless it was made sustainable by bringing it into the capitation funding model and into the RA and registry organizational structures. And without the RA and the registry, RADAR would not be the organized force it is becoming. The RA and BAPN rare renal disease strategy provided the rationale for RADAR, and others had made the first start at a rare kidney disease specific registry. But there were many privacy, governance, organizational challenges to be sorted, and this could only have happened within the RA alongside the registry, with RADAR sharing aspects of its technical platform and funded by capitation. The fifth risk was that the Renal Association might not be able to adapt and modernize its organization. For the first 40 years, the RA was run by individual leaders. A filing cabinet and the support of long-suffering NHS or university secretaries was sufficient. As late as the 1990s, I remember going to dinner with the Renal Association secretary and afterwards spreading out the paper abstracts submitted for the next meeting on his sitting room carpet, so the two of us could divvy them up into piles to create a program for the meeting. It was amateur, but it was sufficient. And the RA has followed a governance development little different from many other medical professional organizations, starting in that amateur way, which for the RA worked for over 40 years. Those old days weren't sloppy, they were different. And then realizing the need to take on an association management company for the RA first Triangle 3 and then MCI, and then going on to self-management with a chief executive and professional staff, rigorous governance, clear lines of responsibility and communication. Much could have gone wrong, but successive RA leadership have made good decisions, knowing when it was time for a move to the next stage, when the cost of new arrangements and structures was justified by their advantages and benefits. And in my judgment, the RA has got it right and has grown solidly and well. A sixth risk was that the Renal Association would be unable to respond to events. Yeah, the RA might go chugging along doing what it's always done, but did it have the leadership and structures to respond when something unexpected happened? Let me give you a few examples. There are, for example, occasional wacky and transient Department of Health or NHS initiatives to be dealt with. One of the best examples is Connecting for Health, that vastly expensive, ill-fated failure in the noughties, which imagined that digital health systems could be developed for the NHS by computer experts with little or no input from mere health professionals. We laugh now. But its impact was not only in their failure to produce workable clinical software systems. At its worst, there was talk that the UK Renal Registry would be superseded by NHS central data collection. We'll automatically collect all you need, they told us, and then hand you a file of data ready for you to analyze, they told us. They, of course, retreated when they realized their ignorance of the detailed workings of the registry. For example, the very detailed data verification that was required. But there was a transient risk that the registry would be wrested from the Renal Association. And RA leaders with senior clinicians from other specialties had to fight our corner, including giving evidence to the Commons Health Select Committee to protect our achievements. There have been different sorts of new challenges to respond to. Another example, HIV infection. Looking back, it did not seem to overwhelm renal units in the way some at first feared. And that was because we had the experience, the policies, the practice standards to deal with it as we had with other blood-borne viruses. We just got on with it. Or another different example, when clinical standards, soon to be called clinical practice guidelines, began to come into vogue, the RA understood the principles of evidence-based real-world guidance and got on with producing it. The RA was always at the forefront. When KDIGO began to work on global guidelines about 20 years ago, they called together for advice those who had already demonstrated track record through the quality of their guidelines. And the RA, along with guideline organizations from the USA and Canada and Australia, were the only invitees. And the most topical new challenge, of course, has been coronavirus. And watching as an outsider, I think the RA's response over the last 18 months has been remarkably strong. The RA's organizational structures and the quality of its leadership have ensured they've led the kidney community in a response which covered the whole gamut of need, has been extraordinarily effective, and in a very short time. So the RA has been good at being reactive, but what about creating new opportunities? Let me give you one example. For decades, we had all bemoaned that acute kidney injury, which consumed so much of our clinical time, was our Cinderella. No one took responsibility for it. No one really knew who paid for it. So much of it sat in the arena of other acute specialties as well as primary care, making it very difficult for us to drive improvements. So why did that change? Why do we now have a national movement about AKI, which covers clinical care responsibility, reporting, education, and research? Why is it on everyone's agenda? It only happened because the RA leadership saw and created an opportunity to convince NCPOD and also the Scottish Audit for Surgical Mortality that AKI should be studied, and to lobby them hard until they did the work which produced that NCPOD report, AKI Adding Insult to Injury, which provided us with the profile, the national attention, and the levers for change. It would never have happened without the Renal Association. So I give you the Renal Association and its remarkable 71 years. The RA thanks its members and leaders, dead and alive, who've done so much and helped the RA to miss very few opportunities and make very few false steps. The RA has maintained and developed its leadership in education, in research, in policy. It avoided the risk of splitting. It moved from purely a scientific organization to be a clinical opinion leader and a policy influencer. It's worked to meet the needs of the widening nephrology community. It's grasped the opportunities of the health informatics revolution. It's continued to adapt its organization and governance, and it's proved itself able to respond to events and to create new opportunities. Much of this success is to do with the quality of leadership. Past RA leaders have understood the adage that you get in, get on, and then get out. With rare exceptions, they've known that their influence was stretching and demanding, rewarding, but transient. And when it was time to step away, they've understood that you only have yourself to blame if your successors have not been trained well enough to continue and indeed improve the work. For me, as a young RA member, the leaders were approachable heroes, and they need to remain so. We must continue to have leadership free from self-importance and with sufficient guile and craft to negotiate the egos and absurdities of the other organizations with whom we interface. I'm not just being nostalgic for the old days when we could all crowd into the Bar of the Lamb. The bars are bigger now and different, but we lose at our peril that informal mentorship based on respect, which has made the RA what it is, which helps to generate in newcomers passion for the work and a deep-seated culture of philanthropy towards people with kidney disease, which are the hallmarks of what we do. I give you the Renal Association, 71 years old, all it has been and all it has done.